Hi everybody, it's Julie Hester, and I'm going to demonstrate how to create simple functions in a C++ program. I went ahead and started my program by creating or including three libraries, IOStream, IOManip, and String, and then I created the framework for the main function. Now the simplest kind of function you can create would be a function that has no parameters or data going into the function and returning no data. So let's create one of those first. I'm just going to create a very simple function called print hello. And all it's going to do is print hello on the console window. So because this function is not going to return data, I'm going to indicate that by putting void as my return data type. I have to have something in the data type part of my function definition. So we'll use void whenever we aren't actually returning data. I'm going to follow void then by the name of my function, print hello. And then finally, just like it looks in main, I'm going to have empty parentheses. Followed by my code block. So this looks a lot like my main function, except main returns an integer, and this function doesn't return anything at all. For the function body, I'm just going to add a single line of code. And then that's all I have to put in this function. Because we're not returning data, we don't even have to have a return statement. And now that we've created the function, I'm going to add a function call in main to call this function. So all I have to do is put the name of the function, followed by empty parentheses because we aren't passing data to this function, and then a semicolon. And that's all this program needs to call the print hello function. So I can test this by coming up here and saying start without debugging. And when my program runs, the only thing that happens is it prints hello out on the console window. Now I'm going to create a second function, but this function is going to return a value. And this function is going to ask the user for their name, and it's going to return the string value with their name in it. Now I can place this function either before or after the first function that I created, and it doesn't matter at all as long as I place it above main. Also, these functions have to be completely independent of main. They aren't going to share data or variables, and these functions are not embedded inside of main. When I get the user's name, I'm going to want to return that value as a string. So I'll say string, and I'm going to call the function getUserName. And we want to use names that describe what the function is, so when we read our code, we have an idea of what's going on. So in this function, I'm going to prompt the user to enter their name. Then I'm going to read that from the console window and then return that value. In order to do that, I'm going to need a variable inside this function. And I'll just call it name. Now this variable can only be seen by this function. Main cannot see this variable, and print hello cannot see this variable. It only belongs to this function, and it only exists while this function's executing. I'll go ahead and build my prompt. And then, if I want to read a user's name, it's possible that their name may have spaces in it. And if I use CN, I'll only read up to the first space. So instead of cin, I'm going to use getLine to read the entire line of whatever the user enters. And getLine has another function. It has two parameters. First one is going to be cin. Where do I want to get the data from? And the second parameter is the variable where we're storing the value. Now that I've gotten the name from the user, I want to return that variable to the function that called this function. So I'm going to say return name. Now inside of main, I'm going to create another variable to hold the username. This variable will only belong to main. And I could use the same name as the variable inside getUsername or a different name. Totally doesn't matter because they're absolutely independent of each other. Yeah, I think I'll put this function call after the function call to print hello. And so let's start with the function name, getUsername. Visual Studio is trying to help me out so I don't even have to type the whole thing. And this function has no parameters, so I'll leave the parentheses empty and have a semicolon. And I could run the program and this would work, but I would not get a value, or I would not save the value that's returned to me. So I want to save whatever this function returns in my variable username. And I'll just use a simple assignment operator to assign this variable to the value returned by the function. And then after we get that, we'll just echo it back on the screen. All right, so I want to test this program now. And I still have that first function call in there to print hello. And now the second function is asking me for my name. And that's where I am right now. Right now I'm inside the second function. So I will enter a name here. And as soon as I press enter, the function is going to read that value from cin, or from my console window, save the value of the string in variable name, and then return it back to main. And that's exactly what happened here. The code got back to main. Let's move this window out. The code returned to main after the getUsername function call, and then I was able to display that variable on the window. Now what I want to do next with this program is I'm going to ask the user how many of an item that they want to purchase. And after I know how many they want, then I'm going to call a third function to calculate their total. So I'm going to start inside of main. And if we're going to be asking the user for the quantity of an item, I need a variable for that. I'll come up here and I'll create an integer variable. And I'm also going to want to have a double that's going to hold the amount due. That value will be populated from my third function once I get that function call built. All right. So I'm going to prompt the user for a quantity. And I think to do this, I'm going to combine this cout with the username that we just showed. by getting rid of this inline up here. That way these two lines will run together and it'll look kind of like a conversation. Now this time I'm getting an integer number from the user, so I don't want to use getLine. I can just get that value using cin. And now that I know how many the user wants to purchase, I can calculate the total due. With that, we're going to use a function. So I'm going to come back up here to this area above main, and I'm just going to add it right after the last function. Again, the order doesn't matter as long as the functions aren't calling each other. So what I want this function to do is I want it to take in a quantity and a price and multiply them together, and then add sales tax and return the total. So this function signature will look something like this. I want it to return a double. That's my return data type. The name of the function is going to be calculate total. And this function is going to have two parameters. It's going to have a parameter for the quantity and a parameter for the price. And now, since I'm using two parameters, it's going to be important that I list them in the order here, or when I make the function call to this function, I list them in the same order as I put them here in the function heading. My first parameter will be the quantity of items. That's an integer variable, and so I have to indicate in my parameter list that this is going to be an integer. That way my function knows what to expect. The second parameter is the price. And I'm going to make the price a variable so that I could calculate totals for different kinds of items of different prices. So, oftentimes prices are going to be using a double because we're working with money and dollars and cents, and we want to be able to have those fractional values. So I will say double price. Once I'm inside this function, I can use quantity and price just like I would use any other variable. I'm going to want to do some calculations and come up with a total. So I need a variable for that. That's also going to be a double, and I'm going to call it total. So first, how I'm going to calculate this is I'm just going to multiply quantity by price. So I can say total equals quantity times price. But I also want to add sales tax to this. And a lot of times when we're working with sales tax, we'll use a named constant to hold the value or the current sales tax rate. So how I'm going to do this is I could put a named constant inside a calculate total, but this is a number that I might want to use with different functions. So I'm actually going to come up to the very top here, and I'm going to create my named constant before any of my functions are defined. So I'll use const to indicate it's a constant. It's a data type double. And then I'm going to name it sales tax. And a good standard to follow is to always use all caps with our named constants so that they stand out in our code. And when we see them, we know they're a named constant. I'm going to set my sales tax rate to 8.25%. And now I can use that name sales tax to represent my sales tax rate. Now, just a word of caution here, I'm naming or creating a named constant outside of all of the functions, but I never want to create a variable outside of the functions. Any variable you create needs to stay inside the functions. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to collapse these other little functions by clicking on this minus sign, give me a little more room to work. And then I'm going to do my final calculation here. And I want to calculate the sales tax and then add it to total. I'm going to do that here with a combined operator plus equal total times sales tax. And now that my total calculation is complete, all I have to do is return the variable total. And that should complete that function. Of course, in order to test it, I need to add a function call to it. So now down here in main, after I get the quantity, I'm going to want to make a function call to that new function. And I want to assign whatever value it returns to my variable total due. And when I'm working with these function names, as soon as I start typing some of the name, Visual Studio is going to pop up a little list of things that begin with those letters. And if my function is at the top of that list, I can just press Tab and it will fill out that name for me. That can be really helpful because these function names are case sensitive, and if you don't get the capitalization the same in the function call and in the function, then it's not going to work when you go to compile and link your program. All right. I also have a little pop-up window here. It's very small, but it indicates the two types of parameters that this function requires. So if I can't remember what the function requires, I have it right there in front of me, and I can see the order. I'm going to pass the quantity that the user specified in as my first parameter, and I'm just going to make all of these items be $7.99. So now I have a function call to calculate total. I'm passing a variable into it, and I'm also passing a literal of type double into the function. All right, so now that we have gotten the total due back from the function, let's go ahead and echo that all on the screen. I'm not going to format this really particularly right now because I'm going to do something else with it in a moment. But for testing purposes, I do want to be able to see it on the screen. So let's see how that works. All right, here's my program running again, asking me for my name. I'll put in a name there. And now I can see the name echoed back to me, and it's asking me a question. How many widgets do I want to buy? I'm going to buy 7. And now what I see is that the result is $60.54. So I probably want to do a quick check in my head to see, does that number make sense? And looking at the numbers I'm working with, I wanted to buy 7 at a price of $7.99, so that's about 8. 7 times 8 is 56. We're going to add a little bit for sales tax. $60 seems about right. So it looks like the calculation's correct. Now that we have our total for the number or the price of the widgets, I want to change how I'm displaying the result here. I just did a really simple thing on line 42 where I displayed the number that was returned. But I want to do a little more formatting and make this a little fancier. So I'm actually going to move that code into a function with some other things in it. This function is going to be called print receipt. So I'm going to come back up here where all my functions are. This function is going to print a receipt for the price or the total that's passed into it. But this function is not going to return anything, so I'm going to put void as a placeholder for a data type, followed by the name of the function, and then I'm going to pass a single variable into this function. It's going to be a double, and I'm going to call it total. And what I want to do is print the total out for the user. So I can come down here to where I had my total due. It's now on line 46, and I can just do a cut and paste. And I don't know why Visual Studio thinks that's so hard. All right, it looks like it's finished with whatever it was doing. I'm going to paste that inside this function. Now I'm using a different variable name here, and the variable name in the function needs to match the one in the parameter list. So I can easily edit that by getting rid of those 3 letters. And now it says total. So all I've really done is move 1 line of code, but let's add some other things to this receipt. First of all, when I display the total, I don't want to see decimal places beyond 2 decimal places. So I'm going to use iomanip to alter the number of decimal places displayed. I'll put in fixed and set precision to. That should take care of that. And then I think I'm going to put a line of equal signs above this line to kind of set it apart. And one way I can do that is using set fill. I'm going to say set fill. This is the character that I want to display. And I want to have a field that is 30 characters wide. And I'll follow that by a single space to force it to print it there. That's going to print a line with 30 equal signs. And if I wanted, I could repeat this line and I could put it after the total. And then let's do something here a little fancier here. Total due, the $, something like that. So instead of having a simple cout statement with the total, now I've put some extra things in here for formatting. And I'm going to come down to main. And where I had that 1 line that I took out, I'm going to replace that with a function call to print receipt. And what does print receipt need as a parameter? It needs the total due. Print receipt isn't going to return anything, so I'm not going to assign it to a value. So I'm going to pass that total due to print receipt. Print receipt will come up here, it will get called. We'll set that formatting for 2 decimal places. We'll print a line of equal signs, print the total due, and another line of equal signs. All right, here we are in the program. This time I am going to buy 12 items. And now when it prints, I see that line with the equal signs, and I can see that my price or total due has been formatted. Now when I ran the program, I noticed that the 30 equal signs weren't quite what I wanted. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to get rid of about 5 of them. I'm going to make it 25. Test that program again. And now I see that I changed one of the lines of code where I printed the equal signs, but I didn't change the other line where I had the equal signs. And this is one of the problems you have when you have repeated code. If you need to go back and modify it, you have to remember to modify it everywhere. And you may not. Now here they're right next to each other, so I probably wouldn't make this mistake, but this is certainly a problem with maintaining software. So what we're going to do instead of having this repeated line here is I'm going to replace it with a function call for a function that does nothing but print the equal signs. Then if I want to change it later, I only have to change it in one place inside that function. So I'm going to create a function that will be called from the print receipt function. So this function is going to be called print line. And I'm going to move that line of code into that function. We don't need to pass any parameters into this function, and we don't need to return any values. So it's a very simple function. So now I need to put where I had that line of code a call to the print line function. And then I'm going to replace that other line also with a call to the print line function. So what will happen when this program runs is main will call print receipt, and then print receipt will call print line, and print receipt will call print line a second time. Well, let's test this out here. And we do have an error. It says that I have a build error, blah, blah, blah. Well, I don't want to run the last one because I changed it for a reason. And I'm getting a message here that it says print line identifier not found. But I just defined the function, so why am I getting this kind of an error? Well, the answer is when my program is compiled, we'll close out the little error windows there. When my program is compiled, the compiler is going to start at the very top and read from top to bottom. And whenever it sees the name of a function, that name needs to have already been defined, either through a full function definition here or a function prototype. Well, the way I created this is I had the print receipt function up here on line 29. It made a call to print line, but print line wasn't defined until line 36. So when I was at the point of compiling print receipt, it had no idea what print line was, it hadn't seen it yet, and that's what it's complaining about. Well, instead, I'm going to have to move this function before the print receipt function. So the order of these functions in general doesn't matter when I put them in the file, except if one of these functions is going to call a function, I need to have already put that function in the file. Let's see if this works better this time. And it did compile, so it's much happier with that. All right, how many widgets are we going to buy this time? Let's go for a bigger number. I'm going to buy 49. And now it looks like everything is formatting just the way I want it. I have my line of equal signs that was created by the print line function, which was called from the print receipt function. So all of that looks good, and we got rid of that repeated line of code. Now I can change the 25 to a 20 or whatever I want it to be, or maybe I don't want equal signs anymore or whatever. I only have to modify it in one place. All right, so I think I want to further expand my program by adding some user validation. Right now I'm asking them how many widgets they want to buy. And I'm pretty much accepting anything that they say. So for example, if I put in a number that doesn't make any sense, like -23, I'm going to see now that my total due is a negative amount. So in a sense, the store is paying me. And maybe we could say that's doing an item return or something like that. But I don't think I want my program to deal with negative numbers. So I'm going to want to add some user validation to this program. And when I look at my main function, I'm seeing that it's starting to get a little bit long. It's not terribly long, but if I add a loop to do some user validation and some other things, it's going to start getting longer and longer. And I don't want this function to get too long. I want to try to keep my functions relatively small. So I think I'm going to move the part of the program where I get the number from the user to its own function and keep main as mostly a function that calls functions. So we're going to create another function. I'm going to minimize the ones that we're not working with right now. All right. Now this function, what it's going to be doing is it's going to ask the user how many widgets they want to buy and figure out what that number is. This function will need to return that number. So it's going to return an integer. I'm going to call my function getQuantity. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the user for a number, but if they give me an invalid number, I'm going to continue to ask them until they give me a valid number. Let's go ahead and move these two lines of code up to inside this function, print quantity or get quantity. And right away, I'm going to see that I need to create a variable. I can copy and paste that, but I do need a variable to store the quantity in. Let's create that here, and I can use the same name as the one I had in main. It's going to be completely separate when the program runs. And now what I've pretty much done is replicate what I had in main. And of course, down here in main where I had asked for the quantity, I want to replace that with a function call. And so I'm going to say quantity equals get quantity. Now I'll use that function to get the quantity from the user, save that in my variable quantity, and then I can pass it to the calculate total function. Now before I go ahead and add that extra error logic, I want to test this because I've been moving things around and I want to make sure I haven't made any errors when I've been working with this. When we're writing programs, we want to code a little and test a little. And I can already see that I have an error. But because I didn't add a lot of code to this function, the possibilities for what's causing this error is a pretty short list. I want to say no, I don't want to run the last one, I want to fix it. And this is one of those errors where I really don't like how it's shown in Visual Studio. It says cl.exe exited with code 2, which is a very useless message. But I did see something flash up when it was compiling. It's right over, no, that wasn't, that just says failed. And it's really not giving me, well, there is a clue actually. it says over here on line 45, I have an error. My getQuantity function must return a value. Let's close that out. So it's saying on line 45, this function needed to return a value and it's not returning a value. So we need to fix that. I'll put in a return statement and quantity. I'll even separate it with a little space there to kind of set it off. And let's try to test this variation of the program. All right, so now I'm inside my getQuantity function, and I can put in a number here, and the rest of the program executes as it had. But one thing I want to do when I compile this program, yes, the program ran correctly, but there was a warning in this program output, or my compile output. And I should always read my warnings to see if there's something important in there. And this is telling me that I'm doing a conversion of data types. I have a double and I'm returning it as an integer. So when I look up here inside this function, I can see, oh, this is not the right data type. The data type of what I return needs to match the data type of the function's return variable. So that's an int. The function's returning an int, but I defined it as a double. So one of these needs to change. And in this case, when we're working with a quantity, we're only going to allow the user to buy whole number items. So double doesn't really make sense anyway. I'm going to change that to an int. All right. And now if I were to go and rebuild the program, I can just say build solution. Now that I've modified it, I'm not going to actually execute it. I can see that the warning has gone away. All right. So what I want to add to this function now is some error logic that's going to look at the value that was returned. And if the user enters a negative number, I don't want to accept that value. I'm going to put this in a do while loop. So I'm going to say do. These two lines of code will be the loop body. And I want to execute this as long as quantity is less than 0. So with the do while loop, we always execute the loop body at least one time. I'll go into the loop. I'll ask for the number of widgets, read in that value, and if the user gives me a negative value, then I'm going to ask again. And I'll probably want to get rid of this comma too, because that will look a little weird if I'm asking multiple times. But let's see if this works. All right, I'm going to test it by entering a negative number. And I see that the do while logic is working because it repeated the prompt for me. It's asking me again how many I want to buy. Well, I'm insisting, no, I really want a negative number. And it's going to continue to do this as long as I enter negative numbers. But if I change it to 10, now I'll see that the rest of the program executes as we desire. So I think I'm just going to clean this up by putting in here, maybe a /n. I could put in a line and change it like this. Or another thing I could do is I could pass the name to this function. And that might be a nice thing to do. So let's add a parameter to this function, a string of name. And now we can say cout, we'll say name. How many do you want to buy? So that should work, and now I'll be able to repeat the name every time I have to reprompt for the quantity. Well, now I have another error. Let's take a look at this. It says that the getQuantity function does not take 0 arguments. So what's going on here? Well, this has to do with where my function call is. Well, right here, it says I need to go down to line 60. And now I have a little red line next to my parentheses, and it says that I have too few arguments in my function call. I just changed that function to require a string parameter, but I'm not passing a string to the function. So I'm going to need to modify this by adding username and pass that string into this function so that it can display the name as I had done before. All right, and it does look a little bit funny right there. I'm seeing the name twice. Let's put our negative number. Now, that prompt looks okay. So it looks okay the second time. Let's put in a third here. And it looks like the prompt is fine every time I have an error, but the first time it looks a little weird because it displayed the name twice. So what's going on here? Why is the first one different? The answer is not inside the function getQuantity, but what's happening in main, as soon as I got the username, I echoed it back on the console window, and then I went to getQuantity, which echoed it again. We're going to get rid of line 58. Go ahead and put a little comment there, and let's see if this looks a little bit better. All right, that does look better. I'm only seeing the name echoed one time. Just continue to test a few things here to make sure it's working still as I think it should be. And all of that looks pretty good. So we've created a number of functions here in this program. And when I look at the main function, it has 3 variables and then it has several function calls. Now, all of the lines of code inside of main fit on my screen. I can see the entire function easily. And I've basically delegated all of the work to different functions. It gives me the benefit of where I had repeated code, like printing the line inside of print receipt. That repeated code is now or is being reused. I have the reusability with the print line function. And then all of this is much more maintainable because it's all segmented out into different places. So that's how you can create some simple functions that accept different types of parameters and return different types of values.